One of the things I would say is that a slip or relapse is possible. It's not inevitable.
There's a great way to say that.
And for a lot of people, because of the information they've been exposed to, they begin to believe that it is inevitable. And in some ways, it even becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if I believe that from this point forward, I can choose recovery, I can choose sobriety, then I gather whatever resources I need in order to make that happen. I live into that reality. When men come to the workshop, the first spiritual question that we talk about is, do you want to be well? And the way that we frame that is, what's true is for all of us, there's a part of us that wants to be well. And if we're honest, there's a part of us that doesn't want to be well. Well, what we're doing in our recovery is we're strengthening that part of us that wants to be well. Because what we know is what I desire, I pursue. And if I want wellness, I'm going to go after wellness.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and we're here today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, how are you?
I'm doing well.
And we are especially pleased to have the director of Faithful and True, Deb Laaser, with us today. Deb, how are you?
Yes, I'm doing well too. Thanks, Randy.
Good. Thanks for joining us today. We were excited to have you on board for today's discussion. And tell our audience what we're going to be talking about today, Greg.
Yeah, what we're going to be talking about is kind of the reality and the ramifications when there has been a lot of slips and slides, so that when someone is not really fully in recovery and maintaining sobriety, what that does to them in their own recovery and the impact that it has on their spouse. And so kind of to distinguish, we often talk about slips and relapses. What we would say is a slip is just a temporary, momentary decision not to be engaged in recovery and to move towards the acting out. Maybe it's that momentary of seeing something or seeking out something, but quickly, moving away from that. The relapse is when for a time frame, I'm re-engaging my addiction. I'm not being honest about it. I'm hiding it. I may be viewing pornography or some of the other things that I've identified as red circle things, but I've been doing it for a while. And what we know is whether it's a slip or it's a relapse, it creates disruption for the spouse. And it also becomes significant for the man to look at, to understand what's going on for me, that I find myself back in this place.
So I think it's good also, Greg, and for our audience to know that here we do have high standards that I know you all recommend when people come here for help from an addiction or compulsive behaviors, and that is we believe there can be full sobriety. And I know on the internet and various places people read, and especially wives that I hear from, there's not a lot of positive news about that if they're married to someone, it may look like this for the rest of their life. And I want them to hear the hope that we have at Faithful and True, that we know it's possible. And there are men like you and Mark and others and our leaders here who have proven that to be true.
Right.
So it's not always a necessary part to have a slip or relapse as part of a program. And yet, I think what we're trying to talk about today is if it were to happen, what can we look to that may be missing from the program so that we can help someone kind of get out of the pothole and back on the road and running again?
Right. One of the things I would say is that a slip or relapse is possible. It's not inevitable.
There's a great way to say that.
And for a lot of people, because of the information they've been exposed to, they begin to believe that it is inevitable. And in some ways, it even becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if I believe that from this point forward, I can choose recovery, I can choose sobriety, then I gather whatever resources I need in order to make that happen. I live into that reality. One of the principles that we teach is you do whatever it takes for as long as it takes in order to be in recovery and maintain sobriety. And so that's part of the issue, when men come to the workshop, the first spiritual question that we talk about is, do you want to be well? And the way that we frame that is, what's true is for all of us, there's a part of us that wants to be well. And if we're honest, there's a part of us that doesn't want to be well. Well, what we're doing in our recovery is we're strengthening that part of us that wants to be well. Because what we know is what I desire, I pursue. And if I want wellness, I'm going to go after wellness. But we also want to acknowledge, for those of us who have struggled with addiction, it has played a role in our life, even though it's been destructive. And it may be difficult to give that up, or even to believe it's possible to give it up. So what we're wanting to do over time is strengthen that part of us that wants to be well. So we're willing to do whatever we have to do to be sober, and diminishing that part of us that still believes the addiction serves some value in our life. I like the image of fires. There are these two fires that we have at the beginning of our recovery. One is the desire to be well. One is the desire to stay in the addiction. We want to take away the fuel on the fire that keeps us in the addiction, and we want to strengthen the fire that wants to be well and continue to put fuel on that. So the first thing, if I'm talking to someone who is struggling with sobriety, we are going to talk about that desire. Do you desire to be well? And if it doesn't seem strong, then let's talk about that. Why isn't that strong? And many times it's because there's a minimizing of the consequences, or there's a minimizing of the impact that addiction has on our lives, and we're dismissing it in such a way that we're giving ourselves permission to continue to act out.
We have noticed that over the years, that while it's very difficult to have a lot of consequences from an addiction, like loss of money or loss of a job or loss of your spouse or family, incarceration, loss of reputation through newspaper articles or what people are saying. And consequences can be very devastating on the front end, and yet they can serve to create the kind of pain that motivates someone to really want a different life. And so we understand how hard it is when there haven't been consequences.
Right.
And so that could be one of the issues that makes it difficult to fully engage in a recovery program.
Right. One of the things we talk about at the workshop is that for most of us, our initial energy for recovery is desperation. And desperation can be a good short-term motivation. I'm desperate. Maybe I got caught, or my wife discovered something, and so now I'm really desperate. Well, the reality is desperation is a short-term motivation, and if the man doesn't find desire, no matter how many consequences there's been, if all I've got is desperation, at some point that will fade. And when it fades, I find myself back into the addiction. And so we want to acknowledge desperation, but at the same time, we're going to be helping men to really get into that. This is what I desire for my life. This is how I want to live. This is the kind of man I want to be.
Yeah, it's that internal motivation that we're really looking for, and not the external motivation of either fear or threats from others or checking off boxes to try to get things done that, we notice makes a big difference in how someone progresses. I would say that one of the things I notice for women or wives who are in these committed relationships is that they're looking for ways to start building trust really right from the get-go. And one of the things that's helpful is when they actually hear from their spouse, if they're coming home from our workshop saying, I want to be sober, and I am sober, have been for 7 days or whatever it is. Right. And they're like, good, we're off to a good start. When that goes on, and there has been sobriety and no slip or obviously relapse in that short of a time, I think the trust begins to grow, and the desire and the little hope that begins to grow also can be there. And yet, if slips are starting to happen and they're acknowledged, there can be a good part of that in truth-telling, and that can be a positive thing for a wife. And yet, the slips represent to her, again, the hopelessness that life will never be different. And I talk to the men when I do come to the workshop to say, it's why it's so important if what you want is this relationship eventually. And a trust that can be built here is to take sobriety so seriously that you will do whatever it takes for how long it takes to be sober. And we know it's possible, because it's like ripping the carpet out from underneath a wife. The first time she might be able to pick herself up and say, well, we'll try it again. But what I find is at some point, even my trying to educate them about maybe what's missing from a program is not enough to keep her in it and hopeful.
Right.
And when that happens, I mean, there's no amount of people really that can build that into her to keep her present. And so sometimes it's just too much.
Right.
And I understand that. And so she makes a decision she needs to take care of herself.
Yeah.
So.
You mentioned this idea of sobriety. And one of the things that we believe is that it's very important that the couple has had a conversation defining what sobriety is. Mm-hmm. So that when the husband says, I'm sober, there's a clear understanding of, okay, this is what he means by that. And for us here at Faithful and True, what we teach is we talk about LAMP, sober, and the L stands for no lying. And that's specifically lying about the addiction, the acting out, that I'm being open and honest about what is going on for me sexually. The A is for no affairs, whether they're physical, sexual, emotional, that I'm being committed and loyal to my spouse. M is for masturbation, because what we know is for the person struggling with addiction, masturbation can become a very compulsive, addictive part of their life. And then finally, the P stands for porn. And so that's no pornography in my life in any of the forms. And really one of the best ways to understand pornography is it's any material that I engage specifically to engage or change my neurochemistry. I'm looking for that hit of adrenaline, or I'm wanting some sort of release of dopamine or oxytocin. And a lot of this is unconscious, we're not aware of it. But as I get to know myself, I can begin to say, okay, when I see this kind of material, there is a part of me that wants to take something from it. And it's important that I become really serious about that. Mm-hmm. So we would want for the couple to have a conversation so that the wife clearly understands, okay, when my husband says he's sober, this is what he means by that. And I can trust that we're using the same definition.
I think it's also helpful for couples. Maybe they need that from us professionals to describe what we mean by an emotional affair. It's kind of a fuzzy word, it's like, what do you mean by that? And I think where wives, I've noticed, tend to have a clear understanding for themselves of when they have felt left out and someone else is more a part of their husband's work life or vision or fun or whatever it is, and they're excluded, and oftentimes that they don't even know about it. And so there's a privacy that's going on in another relationship that doesn't include a wife. I think one of the simpler ways of describing it is just, if we have relationships or things are happening with the opposite sex that our wife is a part of it, knows about it, and maybe is even included in it at some point. It's the secrecy of things that might be said or excluded from her that creates the pain in the relationship when there's exclusivity that's expected.
Yeah, and I like that idea of just being aware. Anywhere in my life, do I have a relationship with someone of the opposite sex that my wife, my spouse would not know about? And it could be a person, it could be a conversation, it could be a shared interest, it could be time spent together. But if my thinking would be my wife would be surprised to know about this, or maybe I'm intentionally not wanting to share it because of my wife's reaction, it's that secrecy that creates the chaos.
Exactly. So I think you're right. Understanding and having the same understanding of what we're calling sobriety is very important. I know I had a wife in group many years ago who said that for a year, when they did check-ins together, he checked in that he was sober. But then she realized that he attended a 12-step group where masturbation was an accepted form of acting out. And so he went with that definition rather than our definition, but she didn't know that. And when she found out, she was really hurt and again left out and felt like she'd been lied to. Maybe he wasn't intentionally lying, I don't know, but it did create a lot of chaos in their relationship.
And that's why for the husband, just to be clear, that when I use the word sober, this is what I mean by that. And then there's an agreement to it. There's an understanding, a shared recognition of it. So one of the things I think is helpful, and I've heard you say this to the men, and I think it's important to question. So if somebody is struggling to maintain their sobriety, the question is not what's wrong with you. That's the question of shame. we ask the question, what's missing from your recovery? Is it a resource that is simply needed that you don't have? Could it be a resource that you have, but you're not fully maximizing it? Or is there a need that isn't anywhere on your recovery team that will need to be addressed if you're going to maintain sobriety? So it really refocuses it on the idea of developing the program that's going to move me towards sobriety versus some historic shame message that says, I just can't do this, or I am hopeless. Because one of the things that we know is if in the loss of sobriety, if my shame is engaged, actually the shame will keep me stuck in the addiction because it sends me into hiding. Whereas a healthy exploration and curiosity about what's not in my life that might help me be sober, or what's in my life that's keeping me from being sober, then we can have a conversation about that.
It's interesting because I think when I think of those who are doing really well, I mean, what is true is for the first few years, I mean, it is kind of a full-time job. And I don't know that people really want to hear that. A lot of people are very busy. They may not have a lot of funds for a recovery program. And yet, the longer we spread it out and maybe see a counselor once a month or something instead of every week or every other week, and there's no group yet, and there's no intensives that they've tried. And what's true is the less you put in, the less you're going to get out, and the longer it's going to take. So we're huge encouragers of figuring out what you can do to invest in a program that will carry you as quickly as possible. I think most of us want to be in and out and moving on to life and practicing what we're learning with sobriety and figuring out how we can grow in this process and having more thriving in our life.
Well, and you mentioned this earlier, and it's got to be motivated by the person struggling with the addiction. I hear lots of stories where men are listening to podcasts, or they are reading a book, or they are going to counseling. And yet the energy behind it is they're doing it because somebody else thinks they should do it. And what I regularly say is attendance is not enough for recovery. It's got to be full engagement and participation. And so again, we're back to that desire piece. If I'm doing it for somebody else, it's not going to result in the transformation that I'm needing and I'm looking for. So as somebody is thinking about their own recovery, it's not listing all the things I'm doing, but it really is asking the question, am I maximizing these? Am I stewarding these? If I go to my counselor, do I go with an awareness of what I want to talk about, what I want to work on, what's not working in my life? If I'm going to group, am I showing up honestly and authentically? And am I resourcing the group when I'm not in group? Am I reaching out to my guys in the week? And a lot of times when somebody is struggling, what I'm hearing is, yes, they have resources, but they're not really engaging them or maximizing them. And what we know is we've got to be willing to really get everything we can out in order to be sober.
Yeah. And are they doing self-reflection? Are they really learning about themselves, or are they just reading a book and it's interesting? But how are they integrating it into their own life, and how are they changing? That's really what we want to know, even beyond, am I stopping behaviors that are not creating sobriety for me? But am I growing more patience? Do I have less anger about things and less volatility? Am I less impulsive? Am I taking the time to think about things? Are my relationships growing? Am I more proactive, or I still react to things? Do I let something like work just trump everything in my life? I talked to someone earlier today, and it's like, it's always work. We can't get into a counseling session because work is too busy, or we can't do this because work is this. You know, what is always getting in the way? So it's a really important thing, first of all, to figure out what is in the way from you even engaging in the good resources that could be available.
Right. And you just did a great list. I hope that people will go back and listen to that. Because these are some of the things that you can be asking, what do I want to be working on? You know, I make references to my own recovery, and for years I went to a therapy group, and we as participants were responsible to bring to the group what we wanted to work on. And I'm so thankful for that approach. You know, instead of it just kind of being a free-for-all, you came with an agenda. You said, hey, this is something in my life that isn't working, or I responded in this way, I didn't like that, or I'm finding myself not being open and honest about this emotion or this thing in my life. And it really trained me over time to be asking, okay, what in my life do I want to be different?
Right.
What parts of me do I not like about me, or I don't like how I responded in that, or this is a part, I often think of the fruits of the Spirit. There's this wonderful list of things that we are called to have. And so maybe I'm not as patient, or maybe I'm not as loving. And so what would it look like for me to go after that and to become more patient, become more loving?
Yeah. I think for those who perhaps use mostly 12-step support groups or other support groups that are generally free or almost free, I think the problem might be that those are agenda-oriented, working out of a workbook, and it does keep you from this place you're just talking about, which is looking at your life and figuring out what you want to change and bringing issues into a counseling session to let someone help you with those. And so I think for a lot of people who are struggling with sobriety, the very first thing that could be missing is enough of their own personal counseling that they can initiate, be proactive about, and start studying their life. They're spending money, perhaps. They want to make use of that time, and they start bringing things in to counseling. I know even sometimes when I work with women initially, they might say, well, what do you think I should work on today? And I go, well, first of all, I don't determine the agenda for you. So I want you to be thinking about, where is your peace disturbed and what shall we talk about today? I can lead you down a path of what we can work on changing here, or why your peace is so disturbed. So it's a different modality than going in and working out of a workbook or having an agenda that's kind of predetermined for you. And that's the privilege of a counseling session, I believe, with a professional who's trained to work on those kinds of things.
And one of the things we absolutely believe is that there is a recovery team. So we're not saying that you have this thing exclusively. You have a group, a team of resources that are serving you. So for those of you that are working in a workbook, let the workbook kind of reveal some things about you that you can then take to your group and to your therapist. If you're learning something in your counseling sessions and discovering something, then maybe you go and read a book about that. But it really is very an integrated approach, as this team is providing care, resources, direction, and ultimately, though, you are the one that's responsible. I teach to the men, one of the principles of the recovery team is you are the leader of the team. And one of the mistakes that men make is believing that somebody else, their pastor, their wife, their therapist, their group members, are going to be the leader of their team, and it's just not going to work. And again, it's that determination, that resilience of, I'm going after this because this is something that I want for myself. We do talk about sometimes, okay, if somebody's really committed, they're using their resources, and they're struggling with sobriety, then there could be some pieces that are missing. And so I've heard you talk about that sometimes maybe there's unhealed trauma. And so they're going to need to go after that with a trauma-informed therapist. Maybe it's through experiential work, somatic work, brain spotting, EMDR, but there are some great modalities that help move somebody towards their trauma for healing. What are some of the other things, Deb, that you and Mark have identified and you're aware of that might be missing if somebody sees that they're stuck?
I think one of the big things is community, because there is so much shame, particularly around this addiction, that it's very hard for people to not be isolated or feel maybe comfortable with one therapist and, one pastor helping them or whatever. But we're finding that the group experience is actually essential to getting well. And I know our groups are professionally led, which is a little different than the agenda of sport groups, and yet I think any and all of them can be very helpful. Getting used to in being authentic with other people is a big piece in shedding shame. And so without that, I think it's very hard to make the progress just by yourself. This is why those that even try to heal themselves through reading or workbooks on their own really are going to struggle at some point, because healing shame is done by shedding shame in community.
Yeah, I would even say that there is no recovery without community. That, not only do we shed our shame in community, but we experience grace in community. And so, but again, it's not just I'm a part of it. Am I really maximizing it? it's great if a guy will reach out to his community and say that he's had a slip or relapse. But the reality is, what were you doing prior to that? Were you connected? Were you checking in? If you're feeling sad, are you reaching out to your guys and saying, boy, I'm really feeling sad today? It's amazing how quickly we can slip into isolation. And so what we're wanting is a sense of community where I am known when the days are good and when the days are challenging. That whatever's going on internally, I'm sharing with that. And then others can maybe spot some things going on for me that can be preventative so I don't find myself relapsing. Or maybe I become aware of, wow, I am really lonely, or boy, my anxiety's been high, or my insecurity is getting triggered. And I can share and process that, because then we're back to that idea of self-awareness.
And I think what's interesting about community is it also stirs up all the difficult things in relationships. So there might be, a wife might come to me and say, well, I'm kind of liking group, but there's this woman in there and she thinks she knows everything about everything, and it's really bugging me. And I think I might leave group. And that gives us an opportunity to talk about, well, is that typically how you respond when somebody's disturbing your peace? Is you just pull away? Is that how you want to do that in the future? Or do you want to learn how to speak to that in a healthy way? So you mean like talk to her? And I go, yeah, well, we could practice what that might look like and sound like. And so you can also learn new ways of working through things that bother you, because all relationships are going to have things that bother you.
Well, and if I'm having a strong reaction to someone, a great question is there anyone from my past that this person is reminding me of?
Yeah.
Because then it's not just about this woman in 2025, it's about somebody else that's being pulled in, that then becomes a place for me to continue to do some work and some healing.
Yes.
And I think that's another category. If somebody is struggling in sobriety, typically there's a relational piece.
Of course.
And it could be an unhealed relationship from the past. It could be a current relationship where they're not fully showing up. But what I see in a lot of men is they have this old history of placating and accommodating. Typically they learned as a child. And they're continuing it into the present. And until they're able to find their voice and ask for what they need, or maybe challenge somebody in their life that historically they wouldn't have challenged, they find their addiction as a safe place to retreat from disruptive relationships or challenging relationships.
Absolutely.
So really, I'm not going to be able to be sober if I don't have my voice in the relationships that I have currently, and also to heal some of the old pain historically.
So to move on to another reason why there might be struggles with sobriety is one thing Mark and I got connected to probably 20 years ago when we met Daniel Amen, a psychiatrist in California who does brain imaging. And we began to realize how important it is to look at brain health. Because when our brain is struggling, we will be struggling in some ways. And I think it's very important to assess what issues I may have in terms of mental health or brain health, as Dr. Amen calls it, which I love so much better than the generalization of you've got mental health issues. In some ways, we all have issues with anxiety, and some with depression, and some with OCD, and some with ADD, and some with sleep disorders. And the problem is, if we're not addressing those things, they're going to put a lot more stress on the relationship and also on our need to find ways to comfort ourselves. And so it's very important to look at those things if you're going to get well. And we find for some people who are just really, really stuck, it's the brain issues that really make a difference. And so we try to encourage them to get assessments and figure out how to get help for those brain health issues they have.
And one thing I just want to say, I want to go back to the question. So for the person that is struggling with sobriety, with relapse, and they're not able to maintain sobriety, the question isn't what's wrong with me. The question is what is missing. And I have to begin with the belief that sobriety is possible for me. If I don't believe it's possible for me, then it makes sense I'm not going to realize it. But if I can begin to believe it is possible for me with the right understanding, the right commitment, the right resources, that I'm not, there's a language in addiction and recovery. it's terminal uniqueness. We're afraid that we're the exception. We're so different. But the reality is there's so much commonness in acting out and addictions and the motivation that it's important that we understand that. And, for us, I talk about recovery as meeting a legitimate need in a legitimate way in a repetitive pattern. And the key is I got to identify the legitimate need, and then I got to meet it in a legitimate way, which is going to take courage and vulnerability. I'm going to have to ask for my needs. I'm going to have to validate that I have my needs. And I do believe when the needs begin to be met in legitimate ways, the power of the addiction begins to fade.
One of the other, I know we're getting to the end. Yeah. Oh dear, we can't speak about the spirituality part real quick. That I do think that can be a very big missing piece for many people, is when they haven't really deepened their spiritual relationship with God, they don't understand the practices of surrendering, the practices of grace, as you were talking about earlier, Greg, and certainly the truths about who they are being fearfully and wonderfully made. And when that piece of blessing is missing, there was going to always be coping to try to figure out how to be good enough to be out in the world.
Right.
So a very important piece for many of the men.
And one thing I would add to that is we know that for a lot of men, there has to be healing because there's been so much hurt. That so many of the men come to our workshop as men of faith, but because of the way they experience faith or the church, there's a lot of woundedness and hurt. And before I can engage spirituality, I have to feel safe in my faith experience.
I wanted to bring up one more thing that it's been stirring as we've been talking today, but you let me know if you think it fits.
Okay.
In terms of one of the things that might be missing from a program. And one of those might be a true desire to want to stay in the relationship. Because maybe there's so much anger or frustration at a spouse, and now these things have come to light. So there's all this shame, and there's all of this supposedly work he has to do, which is understandable and true. And there's a lot of pain he's caused to his wife. But underneath all of that, is there still sometimes this desire that I really don't like my life here with this person? And they're sabotaging their sobriety because if they keep slipping and relapsing or whatever, it allows them just to create the distance in the relationship that maybe they can't speak about, but internally they know they want.
Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And a lot of times the way that it comes out is an anger at their spouse around something that they don't feel like they can voice, that they feel like because of their shame, they've lost the ability to communicate that. And so it's kind of a self-fulfilling destruction of I keep acting out versus really dealing with the relationship, trying to address my anger, bringing healing into the relationship. It's probably very unconscious. But what I also know is by acting out, I keep our relationship in the chaos versus really doing what I need to do to bring healing, which we know takes honesty and transparency and vulnerability. And for a lot of men, that just feels too scary. Or they've been told that they've lost their voice in the relationship because of what they've done. And so they end up feeling stuck.
Okay. Well, I just thought I'd bring that up because it seems like it's a good possibility for a number of people.
Right.
And it also, to me, doesn't mean there still isn't hope. The problem is that things haven't been talked about. And so if there are, in fact, things that are disturbing or angering to a man, and he's also acting out from other pain besides, it's like both of those things need to be addressed, you know?
One thing I would say in this particular case, this is where community comes in, where instead of just going and raging at my wife, which is going to create its own kind of chaos, to have my safe group of men that I can express my anger, whatever it is about. Maybe it's a historic aspect of our relationship, or maybe it's a current thing that's going on. But if I can express my rage in my community in a safe way and kind of filter it, and then find my clean anger and then express that in my relationship, probably with a therapist there, then that can begin to bring the healing that we're needing. Because another way to say it is, I think unhealed parts of a relationship can be a contributing factor to somebody struggling with sobriety.
Yeah, I believe that too.
So as I'm talking to a guy about this, typically there are 4 things that I'm going to encourage the guy to really look at. And, we've kind of mentioned these, and if you've listened to the podcast, you've heard me talk about it before. But the first thing is self-awareness. If I'm not self-aware, then I'm not going to be safe, and I'm going to struggle being sober. The second one is transparency. So as I learn stuff about myself, I'm going to share it with my community. I'm going to share it with the people in my life. The third thing is ownership. I'm going to take responsibility for my choices. One of the things I know, if a guy is still blaming somebody else or something else for his loss of sobriety, then he's never going to be able to change it. We can only steward the things we own. And then the final thing is intentionality. I'm going to make intentional choices that move me away from the addiction, that move me towards recovery, that lessen my desire to maintain the addiction and increase my desire to be free. And so I think there's so many conversations that we can have. The key is that man getting clear with himself about what might be those contributing factors, that if I address those, then I can live the sober life that I desire.
Amen, brother.
Well, thank you both, Greg and Deb. I hope that today's message has really struck home with so many of you listening or watching out there. We hope that our podcast is inspiring you to take additional steps in your recovery, and we hope that you will visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find over 550 podcasts such as this one that can be of great help to you as well. You'll also find all of the information online about our 3-day intensive workshops. We have the Men's Journey workshop every month. We also have the Women's Journey workshop for the spouses of those men that struggle. And then we also have 2 different couples workshops that you can look into and contemplate coming to our center here to really bless your relationship and move on to a better place of understanding in your relationship. So thank you for listening and watching today. We hope that this has been helpful to you, and we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.